At 72 years old, Mary Beth discovered that to her own son, she was nothing more than a broken suitcase left on the curb for the garbage truck to haul away. Thrown out of the apartment she had paid rent on for 6 years, abandoned on a rainy October night with nothing but a canvas bag and a rusty key, she heard her son tell her face to face that she had become an embarrassment he could no longer afford. But while they pushed her toward the homeless shelter and told her to sign her name on the waiting list for a county bed, Mary Beth clutched a rusty iron key in her coat pocket. The only thing no one in the family had ever wanted from the inheritance, a collapsing cabin in the Ozark Hills that weeds and silence had been swallowing for over 40 years. What they called a pile of rotten wood, Mary Beth would come to call her second life. And what she found behind the warped door of that forgotten cabin wasn't just a family secret buried under dust and pine needles. It was a discovery that would leave her trembling in the doorway, unable to speak, and would one day bring reporters, collectors, and the very son who had thrown her away begging at her gate. Stay with me until the very end, because you'll see how a homeless grandmother with nothing but a key and a broken heart turned a forgotten ruin into something the entire country could not stop talking about. And the moment her son realizes what he lost will stay with you long after this video ends. And if you believe that life can still surprise you, still reward you, still bloom for you no matter how late the hour, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the full journey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mary Beth Thistlewood had not always been the kind of woman who carried her life in a canvas bag. For most of her years, she had been the steady one, the one who packed the school lunches, the one who worked the early shift at the diner in Cedar Falls, the one who stood by the bedside of her husband, Warwick, through every round of his long illness. When Warwick finally passed, 2 years before this rainy October night, he left behind a modest pension, a folder of medical bills that had eaten through their savings like silverfish through paper, and a grown son named Garrett who had never quite learned how to look his mother in the eye. The apartment Mary Beth had rented for the last 6 years was a small one-bedroom above a laundromat on Birch Street, in a tired part of town where the streetlights flickered more than they shone. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She kept it spotless. She grew tomatoes and coffee cans on the windowsill. She had a rocking chair by the window where she read secondhand novels and wrote long letters to a cousin in Oregon who never wrote back. She had stretched every dollar Warwick had left her until the dollars simply stopped stretching. When the landlord raised the rent by $300, Mary Beth did what any mother believes she is still allowed to do. She called her only child. Garrett Thistlewood was 44 years old, a mid-level regional manager for a chain of auto parts stores, married to a woman named Prin who wore tailored blazers and spoke to Mary Beth in the same tone she used with telemarketers. They lived in a new development on the other side of town, in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn so green it looked painted. They had 2 children, Jasper and Nell, whom Mary Beth had not been allowed to babysit in nearly 4 years, ever since Prin decided that Grandma's apartment smelled too much like old building. "Mom," Garrett said on the phone that September afternoon, in the careful voice he used when he was about to say no, "we just can't. Prin and I are leveraged to the hilt right now. The kids' activities, the mortgage, the second car. Mom, you have to understand, we're not in a position to float you." "I'm not asking you to float me, Garrett. I'm asking for $400 a month. For 3 months. Just until I find a roommate." "Mom." There was a long pause on the line. She could hear Prin's voice in the background, sharp and thin. "Mom, have you thought about the other options? The county has programs. There are places that specialize in this kind of thing. It's not a failure. It's what people do at your age." Mary Beth had set the phone down on her little kitchen table and stared at the coffee canned tomatoes for a long time without moving. 3 weeks later, the eviction notice came. 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday, Garrett pulled up to her building in his silver SUV, stepped out in a clean shirt, and helped her carry her belongings to the curb without ever once taking off his sunglasses. "Mom, the shelter on Delaney Street has a bed open. I already called. They're expecting you." "Garrett, it's just for a little while, until we figure something out." "Garrett, look at me." He didn't. He looked at his watch. He looked at the gutter. He looked at the sky, which was the pale gray of a bruise that had already started healing on someone else. Then he hugged her stiffly, the way a man hugs a coworker at a retirement party, got back into his silver SUV, and drove away. Mary Beth stood on the curb on Birch Street at 72 years old, in her good wool coat, with one canvas bag at her feet, and watched her son disappear around the corner without once tapping the brake lights. Then it started to rain. The shelter on Delaney Street smelled like bleach and wet coats. Mary Beth signed her name on a clipboard with a pen chained to the desk, accepted a folded gray blanket, and was assigned a bottom bunk in a room with 11 other women. She lay awake most of that first night listening to the soft, broken sounds of strangers trying to sleep. In the morning, a woman in the bunk beside hers offered her a paper cup of instant coffee without saying a word. The woman was thin and tall, with silver-white hair pulled back in a single braid and sharp brown eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her name, Mary Beth learned, was Roselle Carrington. She had been at the shelter for 9 weeks. First night is the worst, Roselle said. Second is almost as bad. By the fourth, you stop crying in your sleep. Mostly, Mary Beth tried to smile and failed. Roselle became her anchor. She taught Mary Beth which caseworkers actually returned calls and which ones just nodded and forgot your name. She showed her the library 2 blocks over where you could sit all day in a warm chair and nobody asked you to move. She shared her granola bars without making a thing of it. And on the 4th evening, when Mary Beth finally let herself cry, Roselle sat beside her on the bunk and didn't say a single word, which was exactly the right thing to say. I had a son too, Roselle said later. Much later. He didn't throw me out. He just stopped picking up the phone. I'm not sure which is kinder. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the 8th day in the shelter, a caseworker named Denise handed Mary Beth a small manila envelope. This came for you, she said. Forwarded from your old address. Looks like something from an attorney's office. Mary Beth opened it at the little plastic table in the common room, Roselle watching over her shoulder. Inside were 3 things. A cover letter on letterhead from a law firm in Fayetteville, a yellow deed folded into quarters, and a small iron key, rusted to the color of dried blood. The letter was short. The estate of her maternal great-grandmother, Ismay Thistlewood, had been winding down for decades under the sluggish care of a country attorney who had finally, at 91, decided to retire. In clearing his files, he had found an unclaimed property deed and a key belonging to the last living heir. That heir, according to the paperwork, was Mary Beth. The deed described a parcel of 14 acres in the Ozark foothills of northwest Arkansas, just outside a town called Juniper Bend. On the parcel sat a single structure, a 1.5-story hand-built cabin, last assessed in 1981, current condition listed simply as derelict. Mary Beth stared at the key. She remembered, vaguely, a conversation at a family reunion decades ago. Her mother waving a hand dismissively. Oh, that old place of great-grandma Ismay's. Garrett's father and I looked at it once. It's falling down. The land's worth nothing. Nobody wants to pay taxes on a ghost. The family had let it sit, unclaimed, unvisited for over 40 years. That, Roselle said slowly, is a house. It's a ruin. Mary Beth. Roselle took her by both shoulders and turned her until they were eye to eye. That is a roof, with walls, on land that belongs to you. You understand me? You're not homeless anymore. You have just been too poor to know it. Mary Beth looked down at the key in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. She called Garrett from the shelter's payphone that evening. She told him carefully about the letter. She told him about the cabin in Juniper Bend. Garrett laughed, not cruelly, almost affectionately, the way you laugh at a child who has announced she is going to be an astronaut. Mom, that place? Dad and I drove past it once when I was in high school. It's a shack in the middle of nowhere. There's no power, no water. The nearest town has 1 gas station. You can't live there. You're 72. I know how old I am, Garrett. Mom, be reasonable. Let me look into a proper facility. I've been thinking, and there's a place in Garrett, in Springdale that has a sliding scale for Garrett. I'm going to the cabin. There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke again, his voice had gone flat, the way it did when he was done pretending. Fine. Go freeze to death in the woods, Mom. Don't call me when you need an ambulance. He hung up. Mary Beth stood in the shelter hallway with the dead receiver in her hand and felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger, not even sadness. Something quieter and far more dangerous. She was done asking. Roselle was waiting in the common room with 2 cups of instant coffee and a map of Arkansas she had borrowed from the library, already unfolded on the table. All right, Roselle said. Let's figure out how to get you home. The bus to Fayetteville cost $47. Mary Beth had it, barely, with the last of the money Warwick had tucked into a birthday card the year before he died, still folded in the inner lining of her wallet like a pressed flower. Roselle walked her to the Greyhound station at 5 in the morning, carrying the canvas bag so Mary Beth wouldn't have to. You write me when you get there, Roselle said. You hear me? You write to this shelter, and you tell Denise to read it to me. I want to know you made it. I'll do better than that. When I get settled, you're coming to me. Roselle laughed, but her eyes were wet. Old woman, you don't even know what's waiting for you out there. Then we'll find out together one day. They hugged for a long time on the cold sidewalk. Then Mary Beth climbed onto the bus and pressed her forehead to the window and watched Roselle get smaller and smaller until she was only a silver braid under a street lamp, and then she was gone. The bus rolled west through the long, slow hours of a gray morning. Mary Beth slept against the window and woke when the landscape began to change, the flat roads lifting into soft green hills, the sky widening, the trees thickening into walls of pine and oak on either side. The Ozarks. She had not seen them since she was a child, when her mother had driven her out here once to visit a great aunt, and she had stood in a field of wild daisies taller than her knees. In Fayetteville, she used $15 of her remaining cash on a taxi driver named Hollis, who was willing to take her the last 43 miles out to Juniper Bend. Hollis whistled when she showed him the address on the deed. Ma'am, there's nothing out that way. You sure you got people expecting you? I'm the people expecting me. Hollis didn't say much after that. The paved road turned to gravel. The gravel turned to a rutted dirt track that ran along the shoulder of a pine-covered ridge. A creek appeared and disappeared on their left, flashing silver between the trees. They passed one mailbox in 6 miles. And then, at the end of the track, the trees opened. The cabin sat in a shallow bowl of land, half swallowed by 40 years of forest. It was small, dark, and tilted, built of hand-hewn logs gone silver gray with weather. The porch roof sagged on one side where a support beam had rotted out. A dogwood tree had grown straight up through the back corner of the woodshed. The windows were blind with grime. Wild grapevine climbed the north wall in thick, twisted ropes, pulling the whole building gently sideways, as if the woods were trying to take it back. It was a ruin. It was beautiful. It was hers. Ma'am, Hollis said quietly, I can turn around. I can take you back to town. There's a motel in Fayetteville, $39 a night. Mary Beth opened the door of the taxi and stepped out onto the soft pine needles. Thank you, Hollis. I'm home. He helped her carry the canvas bag to the porch. He refused the last $5 bill she tried to press into his hand. He drove away slowly, watching her in the rearview mirror until the track curved and hid her from view. The rusty iron key fit the lock. It fit so perfectly that Mary Beth's hands began to shake. She had to lean her shoulder against the warped door and push twice before it groaned open, releasing a breath of air that smelled of cedar, cold stone, and 40 years of undisturbed dust. She was still standing in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior, when a voice spoke behind her. Ma'am, I need you to step away from that structure. She turned. A young man was walking up the track in a green uniform, a wide-brimmed hat in one hand and a radio in the other. He was perhaps 30, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and the sun-browned face of someone who worked outdoors for a living. The patch on his shoulder read National Park Service. The adjoining parcel is federal land, he said, not unkindly. We've been watching this cabin for years. It's not safe. Squatters come through here sometimes, and I'd hate for you to. I'm not a squatter. Ma'am. Mary Beth lifted the deed from her coat pocket, unfolded it with trembling hands, and held it out to him. My name is Mary Beth Thistlewood. My great-grandmother built this cabin in 1918, and I've come home. The ranger took the deed. He read it carefully, line by line, his expression shifting from professional skepticism into something softer, something almost like wonder. He looked up at her, at the canvas bag, at the cabin, at the 72-year-old woman in a wool coat standing alone at the edge of the woods at 4 in the afternoon. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my name is Emmett Coa Valdez, and I think you're going to need some help." Emmett Coa Valdez did not leave that first evening until he had done 3 things. He walked the entire perimeter of the cabin with a flashlight and confirmed that the roof, incredibly, was still sound. He hauled in firewood from a stack behind the woodshed that had been drying undisturbed for 4 decades and built a small, careful fire in the stone hearth. And he set a camping lantern, 2 bottles of water, and a sleeve of crackers on the rough plank table without making any speech about it. "I live 6 miles up the ridge," he said at the door. "If anything happens, you fire this." He handed her an orange plastic whistle on a lanyard. 3 short blasts. "Sound carries a long way out here." "Mr. Valdez." Emmett, why are you helping me?" He considered the question seriously, the way some men do when they've learned not to answer quickly. "My grandmother lived alone on a piece of land in New Mexico until she was 91, he said. "Everybody told her she couldn't. She outlived all of them. Good night, Mrs. Thistlewood." Mary Beth slept that first night on a mattress ticking stuffed with old quilts, in front of a fire that cracked and murmured like a living thing. She was cold. She was frightened. She was free. The first week was survival. Emmett returned on the second day with a cousin who worked in well repair, and by sundown the hand pump at the kitchen sink was coughing up cold, clean water from a spring-fed well. On the 4th day, Mary Beth walked the 2 miles into Juniper Bend and introduced herself at the tiny general store, where a woman named Lorene sold her candles, matches, a cast-iron skillet for $3, and the phone number of a man who could deliver a load of firewood on credit if she promised to pay by spring. She cleaned. Room by room, she cleaned. She swept out 40 years of mouse nests and wasp husks and pine needles. She scrubbed the windows with vinegar until the afternoon light poured through them golden and unbroken. She took down the rotted curtains and burned them in the yard. She found, in the kitchen, a set of blue and white stoneware plates so old they had no maker's mark, wrapped in a flour sack, perfectly intact. Garrett called once that first week, on the flip phone Emmett had loaned her until she could get her own line. "Mom, this is insane. Prin and I have been talking. There's still time to get you on the waiting list in Springdale." "Garrett, I'm busy." "Busy doing what?" "I'm sweeping my floor." "Goodbye, Garrett." She hung up, and for the first time in 2 years, she laughed out loud in an empty room. It was on the 11th day that she found it. She was cleaning the smallest of the 3 rooms upstairs, the one tucked under the north eaves that must have been a child's bedroom once, when she noticed that the floorboards in one corner did not quite match the rest. They were newer, or rather, newer by 50 years, pine instead of oak, their edges slightly raised. She knelt down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and pried up the first board with a butter knife. Beneath it was a hollow. Inside the hollow was a trunk. The trunk was small, perhaps the size of a carry-on suitcase, bound in leather straps that crumbled at her touch. She lifted it out slowly and set it on the floor in a shaft of late afternoon sun. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were letters. Hundreds of letters. Letters in thick, creamy envelopes addressed in a looping copperplate hand. Letters bound together with faded blue ribbon, sorted by year. Letters postmarked from places Mary Beth had only read about in books. Paris, Edinburgh, Cairo, New Orleans, San Francisco. Letters written on onion skin and on hotel stationery and on the backs of sheet music. The earliest envelope was dated 1911. The latest was dated 1962. And beneath the letters, wrapped in a linen cloth, were the journals. 12 of them, leather-bound, hand-stitched, their pages crowded with the same looping copperplate and with pressed flowers, ticket stubs, watercolor sketches, and passages of poetry copied out in 3 different languages. Mary Beth opened the oldest journal with shaking fingers. The first page read, in that unmistakable hand, "The private correspondence and travel journals of Ismay Marguerite Thistlewood, begun this 8th day of April, 1911, Juniper Bend, Arkansas. For the eyes of one who comes after, if any such one ever comes." Mary Beth sat down on the bare pine floor of her great-grandmother's cabin, in the slanting gold light of an Ozark afternoon, and she could not speak, could not move, could not do anything but turn the pages one by one. As a woman she had been told her whole life was a simple country widow revealed herself, in her own hand, to have been a poet, a traveler, a correspondent of writers and suffragists, a woman who had lived a secret life of letters for 50 years and then buried the whole of it beneath her own floor, waiting for someone to come home. Mary Beth read until the lantern burned low and her eyes watered from strain. She read on her knees, and then sitting on the floor, and then lying on her side with her cheek pressed against the cool pine boards, turning the pages of a life she had never been told about. Great-grandmother Ismay Thistlewood had come to Juniper Bend in 1910 as a young bride of 19, married to a man named Silas who worked the railroad. Silas had died in a coupling accident in 1914, leaving her a widow at 23 with no children and no family west of the Mississippi. The town had expected her to go home to her people in Baltimore. Instead, she had stayed. She had taught herself to keep bees, to split her own kindling, to shoot a rifle, and to write. She had written to everyone. She had written to a young poet in Paris who would one day be famous. She had written to a Scottish suffragist who sent back pressed heather and news of the long fight for the vote. She had written to a black schoolteacher in New Orleans about the books they were both reading, a correspondence that lasted 31 years. She had written, in the 1920s, to a woman archaeologist working in Egypt, and the archaeologist had written back on stationery from the Shepherds Hotel in Cairo, describing sandstorms and small blue beads dug out of tombs. And Ismay had kept everything, every reply, every envelope, every ticket stub from the one trip she had managed to take in her life, in 1936, on a steamer to New York and back. On the last page of the 12th journal, dated the spring of 1962, the year before Ismay died, she had written a single paragraph. "I have lived a small life on a small piece of land, and I have loved it. But I have also lived a very large life in these pages, with friends I never touched and places I never stood. I hide them here, because I do not know if the world is yet ready for a woman like me. Perhaps one day a granddaughter, or a granddaughter's granddaughter, will lift this floor and know that her blood carried more than bread and mending. Know that you are also made of letters, child. Know that you're also made of elsewhere." Mary Beth wept. She wept for Ismay, buried for 60 years in a country churchyard 3 miles away, with a headstone that read, "Only beloved wife." She wept for herself, for all the years she had believed she came from simple stock, plain stock, stock that had never dreamed of Paris or Cairo or a vote. She wept for the girl she might have been if someone had told her, at 12, that her great-grandmother had corresponded with a Scottish suffragist about the shape of justice. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, closed the trunk, and went downstairs to boil water for tea. Something had shifted. She could feel it, physical as a door swinging open. The rebuilding began in earnest after that. Emmett brought a carpenter friend named Darian, who worked in exchange for Mary Beth teaching his daughter how to bake bread. A retired electrician from Juniper Bend named Mr. Hollinsby wired the cabin for a small solar array in exchange for Ismay's old stoneware plates, which he had admired and which Mary Beth insisted he take. By the end of the second month, Mary Beth had one working light bulb, a small refrigerator that hummed like a contented cat, and a second-hand wood stove that heated the whole downstairs. She also had a purpose. She began, slowly, to transcribe the journals. She bought a cheap notebook from Laureen's store and a package of ballpoint pens, and every evening, by the light of her one bulb, she copied out her great-grandmother's words in her own careful hand. She was not sure, at first, why she was doing it. It simply felt like the only honest answer to what she had found. Ismay had waited 60 years for someone to listen. Mary Beth was listening. Word began to travel in the way it travels in small towns. Lorene mentioned to a customer that the Thistlewood woman up at the old cabin had found some kind of old papers. The customer mentioned it to her sister, who taught 8th grade English at the school in Juniper Bend. The English teacher, whose name was Tamsin Blackwood, drove her ancient Subaru up the rutted track one Saturday morning in late November with a tin of molasses cookies on the passenger seat and a lifetime of love for old books in her heart. Tamsin sat at Mary Beth's kitchen table for 4 hours. She read 3 of the letters and 1 page of the first journal. When she finally looked up, her glasses were fogged with tears. "Mrs. Thistlewood," she said, "Mary Beth, I don't think you understand what you have. Tell me, I think," Tamsin said carefully, "that your great-grandmother was a friend of people whose letters are in the Library of Congress. I think what is sitting in that trunk upstairs belongs in a museum. And I think if you will allow me, I would very much like to help you." Mary Beth poured her another cup of tea. Tamsin Blackwood came back the next Saturday, and the Saturday after that. By the 3rd visit, she had brought a colleague, a retired archivist named Orla Finch, who had spent 31 years cataloging the rare manuscripts collection at a small university in Missouri before arthritis had forced her into early retirement and a quiet widowhood she hadn't quite figured out how to fill. Orla pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves she kept in her purse, opened the first bundle of letters, and did not speak for 20 minutes. When she finally did, her voice was reverent. "Mary Beth, this letter, this one right here, do you know whose signature this is?" "I don't," Orla told her. The name was one Mary Beth had last heard in a high school English class more than half a century ago. A name in textbooks, a name on library buildings. "She wrote to your great-grandmother for 11 years, Orla whispered. Tamsin and Orla began to come every weekend. Word spread. A woman named Philippa Ostergaard, a retired nurse everyone called Pip, heard about the cabin from Orla at the Juniper Bend Community Choir and volunteered to help with the physical labor of sorting, since her hands, she said, were still steady even if her knees were shot. A quilter named Delphine Mwangi, who had moved down to Arkansas from Chicago to be near her late sister's family and had been quietly lonely ever since, came because Tamsin told her Ismay's letters described fabric patterns Delphine had never seen outside museum books. The 4 of them, plus Mary Beth, began gathering at the cabin every Saturday. They called themselves, half-joking, the Cabin Circle. They made strong coffee. They wore Orla's cotton gloves. They read aloud from the letters and journals, passing each page around the kitchen table like a sacrament. Mary Beth watched these women, who had arrived at her door as strangers, fill her cabin with a warmth she had not felt since Warwick died. Pip cackling over a scandalous 1923 letter from the archaeologist in Cairo. Delphine bent over a pressed scrap of Kent cloth Ismay had saved from a correspondent in what was then the Gold Coast. Tamsin, reading a poem aloud in her teacher's voice, and Orla quietly weeping into her handkerchief. They were not finished. None of them. It was Tamsin's niece, visiting from Little Rock at Christmas, who changed everything. She was 26, worked in social media for a nonprofit, and listened to her aunt's story over pecan pie with her mouth slowly falling open. "Aunt Tam, you have to let me post about this." "Oh, honey, Mary Beth is a very private. Please ask her." Mary Beth said yes, cautiously, on one condition: no photos of her face. She was not the story. Ismay was. So the niece drove out to the cabin with a good camera, and she photographed the letters, the journals, the pressed heather, the tiny blue bead from Cairo still wrapped in its 1925 tissue. She photographed Mary Beth's hands in the white cotton gloves, turning a page. She wrote a single thread online that began, "In a falling-down cabin in the Ozarks, a 72-year-old woman just found her great-grandmother's secret life. Wait until you see who wrote to her." By the next morning, the thread had been shared 90,000 times. By the end of the week, it had been shared more than 2 million. The phone calls began. A professor of American literature from Yale, a curator from the Smithsonian, a producer from National Public Radio, a woman from the Library of Congress who cried on the phone when she confirmed that yes, they held the other side of one of the correspondences and had always wondered what had happened to Ismay's replies. And then the offers began. A private collector offered Mary Beth $120,000 for the trunk, sight unseen. A university offered $200,000 and a named archive. A cable network wanted to option the story for a docuseries and quoted a figure that would have let Mary Beth live comfortably for the rest of her life. Mary Beth listened politely to each call, and then one by one, she said no. My great-grandmother hid these letters under a floor because she didn't know if the world was ready for a woman like her, she told the curator from the Smithsonian. She waited 60 years. I'm not going to sell her. I'm going to share her. There's a difference. Instead, she accepted a partnership. The Library of Congress and a university archive in Fayetteville would digitize the collection and make it freely available online. The originals would remain in Juniper Bend, in a small climate-controlled room built onto the back of the cabin with grant money, where they could be visited by appointment by scholars, school children, and any descendant of any correspondent who wanted to come and touch the page. The Cabin Circle would run it. Tamsin would curate. Orla would catalog. Pip would manage visitors. Delphine would lead a textile documentation project on the fabric samples. Mary Beth, who had spent her life being invisible, would be the keeper of the door. For the first time in 72 years, she could not sleep for excitement. Garrett came in April. By then, 14 months had passed since the rainy October night on Birch Street. The cabin had a new roof, reclaimed tin that Darian and Emmett had raised together one long Saturday in February. The porch no longer sagged. A small, neat sign at the mouth of the track read Ismay House, by appointment, carved by a woodworker in Juniper Bend who had refused to take payment. School buses had started coming. A ninth-grade class from Fort Smith had visited in March and sat on folding chairs in the yard, while Tamsin read them a letter Ismay had written in 1919 about the first time she saw women vote. Mary Beth was in the herb bed beside the porch, thinning the mint, when she heard the silver SUV come up the track. She stood up slowly, pressing one hand into the small of her back, and watched her son get out of the car. He had aged. That was the first thing she noticed. 14 months had put gray into his hair at the temples, and a tiredness around his eyes that had not been there before. He was wearing a soft blue shirt she did not recognize and no sunglasses, and he stood beside his car as if he was not sure he was allowed to come closer. Mom, Garrett. They looked at each other across 20 feet of Ozark springtime. A breeze came through the pines. Somewhere up the ridge, Emmett's dog was barking at a squirrel. Can I come up? You can come up. He walked to the porch the way a man walks into a courtroom. She gestured to one of the 2 rocking chairs Pip had found at an estate sale, and he sat down carefully, as if the chair might refuse him. Mary Beth poured him a glass of cold spring water from the pitcher on the little table and set it in front of him without a word. Mom, drink your water first, Garrett. You look dehydrated. He drank. His hand was shaking slightly. When he set the glass down, he stared at it for a long moment before he spoke. Prin left me in January. I'm sorry to hear that. She took the kids to her mother's in Tulsa. The business has been, he stopped, shook his head. I'm not here about that. I'm not. I just wanted you to know. I wanted you to hear it from me. All right. I saw the article, Mom. The one in the Arkansas Gazette. And then my assistant showed me the thing online. About Grandma Ismay. About the letters. His voice cracked, and Mary Beth was surprised to find that she did not want him to cry. Because if he cried, she was afraid of what she might still, against all reason, feel. Mom, I drove past this place with Dad when I was 17. I remember it. He said it was a pile of sticks that wasn't worth the gas to check on. I remember him saying that. I remember him saying it too. And you came here anyway. I came here because there was nowhere else. He put his face in his hands. They sat like that for a long time, a mother and a son on a porch in the Ozarks, with 14 months of silence between them like a wall neither one had yet figured out how to climb. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. Mom, I'm not here to ask you for anything. I want you to know that. I needed to see you. I needed to tell you that I know what I did. I didn't know then, or I did know, and I lied to myself, which is worse. I put my mother on a curb in the rain and drove away, and I told myself I was being practical. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Mary Beth sat very still in a rocking chair. She thought about the shelter. She thought about Roselle, who had moved into the second bedroom of the cabin the month before and was at that very moment inside the kitchen teaching Delphine how to make cornbread the way her grandmother in Mississippi had made it. She thought about the rainy night on Birch Street and the silver SUV and the sunglasses. Then she thought about Ismay, waiting 60 years for someone to come home. "Garrett," she said, "I'm not ready to forgive you. I want you to know that. I know, but I'm not going to turn you away, either. That's not who Ismay was, and it's not who I intend to become. There's a guest cot in the back room. You can stay 2 nights. You can help Pip move the new shelving units into the archive on Saturday. You can chop the firewood that needs chopping. You can meet the women who built this with me. You can eat what we eat, and you can sleep where we sleep. And then we will see." Garrett wept quietly in the rocking chair. "Yes, Mom. Thank you, Mom. Yes." Garrett stayed 2 nights. Then he asked if he could stay 2 more. By the end of the week, he had chopped a full cord of firewood, helped Pip bolt 8 shelving units to the wall of the new archive room, and sat silent and ashen in a folding chair while Tamsin read aloud, at Mary Beth's request, the 1936 letter in which Ismay described standing on the deck of the steamer from New York and watching the Statue of Liberty grow small behind her, knowing she would never travel again in her life, and deciding to be grateful anyway. He came back the following month, and the month after that. He brought Jasper and Nell the 3rd time, shy and uncertain teenagers who had not seen their grandmother in 4 years. Nell cried when she saw the cabin. Jasper, who had grown 6 inches since Mary Beth had last hugged him, asked if he could read one of the letters, and sat on the porch for 3 hours doing exactly that, his phone forgotten in his pocket. Prin did not come. Mary Beth did not ask. The healing between Mary Beth and her son was slow, unfinished work, the way all real healing is. She did not pretend otherwise, but she let him chop her firewood, and she let him sit at her table, and when he drove away each Sunday evening, she stood on the porch and watched until his taillights disappeared around the bend in the track, and she did not, any of those Sundays, hope that he would crash. That, she decided, was its own kind of forgiveness. 2 years after the rainy night on Birch Street, Ismay House hosted its first public open day. 340 people came. They parked along the Ridge Road for half a mile. They walked the track in Sunday, clothes carrying folding chairs and covered dishes. Lorene came from the general store with 2 pans of cornbread. Hollis, the taxi driver, came with his wife and would not let Mary Beth pay him gas money. Emmett came in his Park Service uniform and stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, smiling. Mary Beth spoke from the porch. She was 74 by then. Her voice was not strong, but the crowd was quiet, and the microphone Tamsin's niece had set up carried her words across the yard and out among the pines. 2 years ago, she said, my own son put me on a curb in the rain and drove away. I had a canvas bag, a wool coat, and a rusty key in my pocket that nobody in my family had ever wanted. I was 72 years old, and I had been told in 100 small ways over 100 small days that my time was finished. I want to say something to anyone listening to me who has been told the same thing. They are wrong. My great-grandmother Ismay was a widow at 23. She lived the rest of her life on this piece of land, and the world decided because she was quiet, because she was rural, because she was a woman, that she could not possibly have had a large life. She buried the proof of her largeness under a floorboard, and she waited 60 years for someone to find it. I was that someone, and I want you to understand, I almost wasn't. If I had gone to the shelter and stayed there, if I had listened to my son, if I had believed the story the world was telling me about what a 72-year-old woman is supposed to want, and do and not do, Ismay would still be under that floor. Her letters would have rotted. Her voice would have been lost for good. We are not old furniture. We are not finished. We are not to be set on curbs. Some of us are letters that have been waiting 60 years to be read. Some of us are keys waiting for the right lock. Some of us are cabins in the woods that the world calls worthless, right up until the moment we open the door. It is never, ever too late. You're not too late. I promise you with my whole heart that you're not too late. She stepped back from the microphone. The crowd was silent for a long moment, and then it was not silent at all. Roselle found her afterward in the kitchen and put a hand on her shoulder without saying anything. Tamsin was weeping into a dish towel. Emmett had turned his face away toward the pines. Garrett, standing in the doorway with Jasper and Nell on either side of him, did not trust himself to speak, and so he simply nodded at his mother across the room, and she nodded back, and it was enough. In the months that followed the open day, Ismay House grew in ways Mary Beth had not known to dream of. A small press in Little Rock approached them about publishing a selection of the letters in a hardcover volume, with all proceeds flowing back into the archive. Tamsin took on the editing. Orla wrote the footnotes. Delphine contributed an essay on the fabric samples, and Pip contributed an essay on what it had meant at 68 to find herself useful again in the company of women who had also been told they were finished. The book was titled, at Mary Beth's suggestion, Also Made of Elsewhere, after the line from Ismay's last journal entry. It sold out its first printing in 11 days. The second printing went to schools. Mary Beth insisted on it. A teacher in Ohio wrote to say she had read the book aloud to her 8th grade class, and a boy in the back row, whose grandmother had just died, had come up to her afterward and said he wanted to write down everything he remembered his grandmother ever saying before he forgot. A woman in Arizona wrote to say she had taken the book to her mother in a memory care unit, and that for 40 minutes, reading Ismay's letters aloud, she had her mother back. A young woman in Vermont wrote to say she had been planning to quit graduate school and had changed her mind. Mary Beth read every letter. She kept them in a wooden box on the kitchen table, and when a new one came, she took it out to the porch and read it in the rocking chair with a cup of tea in the light. The cabin circle grew, too. A widow named Junella drove up from Texarkana one afternoon in a dented station wagon, having read about Ismay House online, and asked quietly if there was any work a 71-year-old bookkeeper could do. There was. A retired postal worker named Cordell, who had known Ismay as a child and remembered her handing out peppermints at the old general store, showed up with 3 shoeboxes of his own mother's letters and asked, shyly, if Mary Beth might help him understand what he had. She did. By the end of the 3rd year, the little archive room behind the cabin held not only Ismay's correspondence, but the beginnings of 5 other family collections, all of them preserved by women the world had been ready to discard. Mary Beth turned 75 in the cabin she had inherited, at a table full of women she had not known existed 3 years before, eating a lemon cake Roselle had baked from her grandmother's recipe. Garrett sent flowers. Jasper sent a letter, handwritten, for pages long. Prynne sent a card, the first contact in nearly 3 years, that said only, I have been thinking about what I took from you. I am sorry. I did not expect you to write back. Mary Beth read it twice, set it carefully in the wooden box on the kitchen table with all the other letters, and did not write back. Not yet. That night, when the cake was eaten and the dishes were done and the women had all gone home, Mary Beth walked out into the yard alone. The stars over the Ozarks were thick and cold and impossibly bright. Somewhere up the ridge, Emmett's dog was barking at nothing. The pines moved in a slow, dark wind. She thought about the woman she had been on Birch Street. She thought about the canvas bag at her feet in the rain. She thought about Ismay, 110 years ago, stepping off a train at Juniper Bend Station with a husband who would be dead in 4 years and a life no one had yet given her permission to live. She thought about how much of a life can begin at the exact moment someone else tells you yours is over. That was the true legacy, not the letters, beautiful as they were, not the cabin, restored as it was, not even the book, or the archive, or the open days, or the widows who kept arriving up the rutted track with boxes of their own mother's papers. But the revolutionary idea, spoken aloud on an Ozark porch by a woman the world had tried to throw away, that the last chapter could be the brightest one. Mary Beth Thistlewood had been homeless at 72. She had been a keeper of doors at 74. At 75, she was something for which there was not yet a word, and she was content to let the world invent one in its own time. The door at last was wide open, and the light inside was going to outlive her and outlive her son and outlive the rain on Birch Street and outlive everything anyone had ever said about a woman whose time was supposedly done. Thank you for walking with Mary Beth on this journey. If her story moved you, tell me in the comments, what is the one word that stayed with you? Courage? Home? Awakening? Legacy? Drop your word below, and let's build a community of people who believe the best balloons truly can come last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.